Natalie Parker yanked open the car door and slid inside, exhaling sharply as she leaned back against the seat. "Finally," she muttered, shoving her phone into her purse without a second glance. "Midtown Plaza, please, I'm already late." The driver didn't respond right away. Instead, there was a brief hesitation before a deep, smooth voice filled the space. "I think you have the wrong ride." Natalie's head snapped toward the driver, her pulse kicking up a notch. She was expecting a tired, middle-aged man in a worn-out jacket, not this. The man gripping the steering wheel had sharp cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, and a jawline that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. And he was staring at her with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, her brows knitted together. "Wait, this isn't my ride." "Nope," he said, his lips twitching. "But you did get in like you owned the place, so I was curious where this was going." Natalie's stomach sank. She fumbled for her phone, checking the app. Her ride was still 2 minutes away. Heat rushed to her cheeks. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. Where are you headed?" he asked, cutting her off. She blinked at him. "Midtown Plaza." "But I can just wait for my actual ride," he shrugged, shifting the car into drive. "I'm headed that way, I'll take you." Natalie hesitated. A stranger offering her a ride should have set off alarm bells, but something about him, his confidence, his ease made her believe he wasn't dangerous, and she didn't have time to argue. "Okay," she said cautiously, "but if you try anything weird, I have pepper spray." His low chuckle sent a shiver up her spine. "Noted." As they pulled onto the road, she studied him from the corner of her eye. He didn't look like a typical ride-share driver. His tailored black coat, the expensive watch glinting on his wrist, and the sleek interior of the car made him seem entirely out of place. "You don't do this often, do you?" she asked. He glanced at her, one brow lifting. Drive strangers around," he smirked. No, not smirked, more like a knowing half-smile. "Not really. So why are you doing it now?" He tapped his fingers against the wheel, considering. "Felt like changing up my night." She narrowed her eyes. "That's not an answer," he chuckled again. "Maybe I'll tell you at the end of the ride." Natalie crossed her arms, huffing. "Mysterious. Great." Silence settled between them for a moment, but it wasn't awkward. If anything, there was something charged in the air. It didn't make sense. She didn't even know his name, yet she felt like she was in the middle of something important. "What's at Midtown Plaza?" he asked. "A job interview," she said, exhaling. "For a PR firm. It's a long shot, but I really need this." His gaze flickered toward her. "You don't sound excited." "Oh, I am," she said quickly. I don't know, I feel like I'm always chasing after something that's just out of reach." He was quiet for a beat, as if turning her words over in his mind. "Maybe you're meant for something bigger." She let out a short laugh. "That's a nice thought, but I don't have the luxury of waiting for something bigger. I need a job, I need stability." His fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. "Stability's overrated." She shot him a look. "Says the guy who probably doesn't have to worry about rent." His lips twitched again, but he didn't say anything. A few minutes later, they pulled up in front of Midtown Plaza. Natalie glanced at the time. She wasn't late, thanks to him. "Well," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt, "thanks for the ride, mysterious stranger." "Adrian," he said. She paused, tilting her head. "What?" "My name, it's Adrian." Something about the way he said it made her stomach flutter. "Natalie," she offered. His eyes held hers for a second longer than necessary. "Good luck, Natalie," she nodded, grabbing her purse. But as she stepped out of the car, she hesitated. "Wait," she said, peeking back inside. "Why were you really driving tonight?" Adrian smiled, slow and unreadable. "Maybe I just needed to be in the right place at the right time." And then, before she could press further, he drove off, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with her interview. Natalie forced herself to shake off the strange encounter as she stepped into the sleek, glass-walled lobby of Midtown Plaza. The towering skyscraper was home to some of the most prestigious firms in the city, and tonight, she was here for a chance to prove she belonged among them. She smoothed her dress, inhaled sharply, and walked toward the reception desk, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. "Hi, I'm here for the interview with Sterling & Co." She told the receptionist, a perfectly poised woman in a navy blazer. The woman barely glanced up before handing her a small badge. "20th floor, Conference Room B, they're expecting you." Natalie nodded, gripping the badge tightly as she stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. She looked composed, professional, but beneath the surface, anxiety churned. This was her chance. She had worked tirelessly, sending out resumes, networking, hoping for a break. Sterling & Co. was a powerhouse in the PR world, handling high-profile clients across industries. If she landed this job, it would mean financial stability, a real step forward. The elevator chimed and the doors opened to a modern, minimalist office space. A young assistant led her to the conference room where 3 executives sat waiting. The man in the center, a silver-haired executive with sharp eyes, gestured for her to sit. "Miss Parker, welcome." "Let's get started." The next 30 minutes were a blur of polished answers, careful phrasing, and measured smiles. Natalie felt like she was holding her own until the final question. "Why do you want to work for us?" the woman on the panel asked, her expression unreadable. Natalie hesitated for half a second. The answer should have been easy: prestige, career growth, opportunity, but the words felt hollow on her tongue. Instead, she found herself saying, "Because I want to help shape narratives that matter. I believe the right story told the right way can change everything." The panel exchanged glances. Then the silver-haired man nodded. "Thank you, Miss Parker, we'll be in touch." She stepped out of the conference room, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't a job offer either. By the time she reached the lobby, exhaustion was settling in. She pushed through the revolving doors and into the crisp night air, her thoughts still tangled in the interview, and then she saw him. Adrian. Leaning casually against the side of his car, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable expression. Her brows lifted. "Okay, this is either a crazy coincidence or you're following me." His lips curved slightly. "Neither. I had a meeting in this building." She folded her arms, studying him. "You didn't mention that earlier." "You didn't ask." She huffed a laugh. "You are impossible." He straightened, opening the passenger door. "Come on, you look like you could use a distraction." Natalie hesitated. She barely knew him. But something about him, his quiet confidence, the way he looked at her like he already knew she'd say yes, made her step forward. She slid into the passenger seat, and he shut the door behind her before rounding the car and getting in. As they drove, the city lights blurred past, casting a golden glow inside the car. "How was the interview?" he asked. She sighed, tilting her head back against the seat. "I think it went well, but who knows? They were impossible to read." "Sounds like you impressed them." She turned to him, arching a brow. "You got all that from what I just said," he smirked. "Call it instinct." She shook her head, smiling despite herself. "And what about you? What do you do when you're not mysteriously offering rides to strangers?" His fingers tapped against the steering wheel. "I run a company," she blinked. "Oh, what kind of company?" "A little of everything." She narrowed her eyes. "That's vague." He glanced at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I like to keep things interesting." She rolled her eyes. "You are the most irritatingly cryptic person I've ever met. And yet, you're still here." She opened her mouth to argue, but he wasn't wrong. They pulled into a small, hidden cafe nestled between towering buildings. Warm lights spilled onto the sidewalk, and the scent of coffee and fresh pastries wafted through the air. "Trust me," Adrian said, stepping out. Against her better judgment, against logic, she did. Inside, the cafe was cozy, lined with dark wood bookshelves and soft leather chairs. A barista greeted Adrian like he was a regular, and within minutes, they were seated in a quiet corner with steaming cups of coffee. Natalie wrapped her hands around her mug. "Okay, now I really need to know. Who are you, Adrian?" He exhaled slowly, studying her. "I could ask you the same thing." She tilted her head. "I'm just a girl trying to land a job and not fall apart in the process." His gaze softened. "You're more than that." Something about the way he said it made warmth spread through her chest. She looked at him, really looked at him. There was an air of control about him, like someone used to making decisions, to being in charge, and yet sitting here with her he seemed at ease. "Tell me something real," she said. He considered her for a moment. Then he leaned forward slightly. "My company, my life, it's all built around expectations. But lately I've been wondering if I'm chasing the right things." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected honesty. "That's surprisingly relatable," she admitted, his lips quirked. "Then maybe we understand each other more than you think." The air between them shifted, the energy almost tangible. And for the first time in a long time, Natalie felt like she wasn't just chasing something, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Natalie wasn't sure when coffee had turned into conversation that stretched for hours. She was even less sure when conversation had turned into laughter, into moments where she forgot the restless anxiety clawing at her every day. But somehow, by the time she glanced at her phone, it was past midnight. Her eyes widened. "I should go. I have work in the morning." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What do you do?" She hesitated, reluctant to explain. "It's temporary, just a receptionist job at a law firm." "Not something you love." His tone wasn't judgmental, just observant. She shrugged. "It pays the bills, at least until something better comes along." His gaze lingered on her, unreadable. Then, with a nod, he stood. "I'll take you home." A part of her wanted to argue, to insist she could call a ride, but another part, the same one that had gotten into his car earlier that night, trusted him. They stepped outside into the cool night air. The city had quieted, the streets less crowded, the lights softer. Natalie pulled her coat tighter around herself as Adrian opened the car door for her. "Chivalry isn't dead after all," she murmured as she slid inside. He smirked, shutting the door behind her before taking his seat at the wheel. "I have my moments." The drive was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of silence that felt easy, like neither of them needed to fill it with meaningless chatter. When they pulled up to her apartment, she hesitated, fingers hovering over the door handle. "Thanks for tonight," she said softly. "I think I needed it." His fingers tapped against the steering wheel. "So did I." Something unspoken passed between them, a moment stretched thin with possibilities. But then she smiled, breaking the tension. "See you around, Adrian." With that, she stepped out, shutting the door behind her. But as she walked up the steps to her building, she could still feel his gaze on her, could still hear his voice in her head. She didn't know what this was, but she knew one thing for certain. She wanted to see him again. The next morning, Natalie was back to reality. The fluorescent lights of the law firm buzzed overhead as she settled into her desk. Phones rang constantly. Voices droned in the background, and stacks of paperwork cluttered her space. It was a far cry from the quiet luxury of last night, from the warmth of Adrian's gaze across the cafe table. She shook her head. She was being ridiculous. He was just a guy she'd met by accident, a guy who, for some reason, had taken an interest in her. That didn't mean anything. Right. "Natalie," she jolted, spinning in her chair to find her boss, Mr. Henderson, standing beside her desk with a frown. "Yes. There's a client here for an unscheduled meeting." "Escort him to the conference room." She nodded, grabbing a notepad. "Who is it?" But Mr. Henderson was already walking away. With a sigh, she pushed back her chair and made her way to the lobby. And then she stopped short. Because standing there, looking completely at ease in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire apartment, was Adrian. Her heart stuttered. His expression didn't change when his eyes met hers, but there was something in the way his lips curved slightly, like he was amused at her shock. "Miss Parker," he said smoothly. "Nice to see you again," she swallowed. "You're a client," he finished for her. "Apparently." Her mind raced. He had told her he ran a company, but she'd never asked for details. And now, standing here in the middle of a corporate law firm, she realized just how much she didn't know. Forcing her legs to move, she cleared her throat. "Right. Follow me, mister." She let the sentence trail off, suddenly realizing she didn't know his last name. His lips twitched. Reeves, Adrian Reeves. Reeves. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Shaking off her curiosity, she led him through the halls, past rows of offices filled with lawyers who looked twice as stressed as she felt. Finally, she pushed open the doors to the conference room. She gestured inside. "Wait here. Someone will be with you shortly." But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Natalie." She turned back, pulse kicking up. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching her with something close to amusement. "You can ask," she frowned. "Ask what?" "What you're dying to know." Her lips parted, but she hesitated. Then, deciding she had nothing to lose, she folded her arms. "All right, fine." "What exactly do you do, Adrian Reeves?" The corner of his mouth lifted. "I own Reeves Enterprises." Her stomach dropped. That was why his name sounded familiar. Reeves Enterprises was a conglomerate: real estate, tech, finance. A name that carried weight, power. He wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the wealthiest men in the city. She exhaled slowly. "Well, that's unexpected." His smile deepened. "Is it?" She huffed a laugh. "I mean, yeah, most billionaires don't moonlight as ride-share drivers." "Most don't," he agreed. "But I'm not most." She shook her head. "You really don't like answering questions directly, do you?" He chuckled. "Depends on who's asking." Their eyes held, and for a moment the air thickened. Then, before she could do something stupid like let herself get caught up in whatever this was, she straightened. "I should go." But as she reached for the door handle, his voice stopped her again. "Dinner?" She turned, blinking. "What?" He pushed off the table, stepping closer. "Have dinner with me." Her breath hitched. "Adrian, no pressure," he said smoothly. "Just dinner." A meal between two people who seemed to keep running into each other. She hesitated. Every rational part of her said this was a bad idea. But then she thought about last night, about the way he made her feel like she wasn't just another overworked, underpaid woman trying to get by. Like she was someone interesting. Before she could talk herself out of it, she nodded. "Okay." His smile was slow, satisfied. "I'll pick you up at 7. And just like that, her life, her carefully constructed, predictable life, shifted. Because she had no idea what she was getting into. But she had a feeling Adrian Reeves would change everything. Natalie spent the entire afternoon trying to convince herself she hadn't just agreed to have dinner with a billionaire. She went through the motions of her job, answering phones, filing paperwork, and pretending her heart wasn't racing every time she thought about Adrian Reeves. Because it was racing. And not just because of who he was, though that was definitely part of it. Reeves Enterprises was a big deal. Adrian wasn't just rich. He was the kind of powerful that got his name whispered in high-end boardrooms and splashed across Forbes magazine covers. But it wasn't his money that had her stomach twisting in nervous anticipation. It was him. The way he looked at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to figure out. The way he spoke, always careful, always measured, but somehow still genuine. And the way she felt when she was around him, like she was standing on the edge of something big, something dangerous. So why had she said yes? She didn't have an answer to that. All she knew was that at exactly 6:59 p.m., she was standing in front of her tiny apartment mirror, smoothing down her dress and trying not to freak out. A sharp knock on her door sent her pulse into overdrive. She inhaled deeply, steeling herself before opening it, and there he was. Adrian Reeves, standing in her doorway like he belonged there. He wasn't in a suit tonight, but that didn't make him any less striking. He wore a crisp, dark button-down with the sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal strong forearms, paired with tailored black slacks and a watch that probably cost more than her rent. But it was his eyes that caught her, the way they slowly traveled over her, taking in her dress, the way her hair fell over her shoulders. There was something undeniable in his gaze, something that made her breath catch. "You look." He hesitated, as if searching for the right word. Then with a slow, appreciative smile he settled on, "Stunning." Heat crept up her neck. "You clean up pretty well yourself." His lips twitched. "I try." She grabbed her bag, stepping out and locking the door behind her. "So, where are we going?" He slid his hands into his pockets, watching her with that unreadable expression. "You'll see." A sleek black car was waiting at the curb, different from the one he'd driven her in before. A driver stood by, holding the door open. Natalie's brows lifted. "So, no more playing chauffeur tonight," Adrian smirked. "I figured I'd give myself the night off." She slid into the car, sinking into the plush leather seats. The scent of expensive cologne and something distinctly him filled the space. As the car pulled away, she turned to him. "You do realize I'm not used to this, right?" His gaze flickered to hers. "This, being picked up in a car that probably costs more than my entire life." The corner of his mouth lifted. "It's just a car, Natalie." She let out a soft laugh. Spoken like someone who's never worried about overdraft fees. His expression shifted slightly, but before she could read into it, the car slowed. She turned toward the window and stilled. They weren't at some crowded, overpriced restaurant. They were at a rooftop. More specifically, a private rooftop overlooking the entire city. Soft golden lights were strung overhead, casting a warm glow over the elegantly set table in the center of the space. A small fire pit crackled in the distance, and beyond the railing the skyline stretched endlessly, the city twinkling below like a sea of stars. Natalie's lips parted. "You rented out a rooftop for dinner?" Adrian stepped beside her, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Not exactly." She turned to him, brow raised. He exhaled, almost like he was debating something. Then, finally, he said, "It's mine." She blinked. "You own this building." He gave a one-shouldered shrug, like it was the most casual thing in the world, among others. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you do." A waiter appeared, gesturing toward the table. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Parker, your table is ready." Adrian tilted his head toward her. "Shall we?" Still trying to process everything, she nodded and followed him, settling into the chair across from him. As the waiter poured them each a glass of wine, Natalie exhaled. "I have to admit this is not what I was expecting." Adrian lifted his glass. "Good or bad?" She studied him for a moment before clinking her glass against his. "Still deciding," he smirked. "Fair enough." Dinner was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The food was incredible, perfectly cooked steak, buttery mashed potatoes, a dessert that melted in her mouth. But more than that, it was him. They talked easily, conversation flowing from topic to topic. She told him about growing up in a small town, about moving to the city with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. He told her about his company, about the pressure of running an empire, of living in a world where everyone wanted something from him. "I imagine it gets lonely," she said softly. His fingers brushed against the rim of his glass. "It does." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly. "And you?" "What do you want, Natalie?" The question caught her off guard. She could have given him the easy answer, the one she told herself every day. That she wanted a stable job, financial security, a sense of control. But instead, she found herself saying, "I want to matter." His gaze sharpened. You already do. The sincerity in his voice sent something warm curling in her chest. She swallowed, looking away. You don't even know me. I think I do, he said quietly. And I think you're more than you realize. Her heart stumbled. Before she could respond, a gust of wind swept across the rooftop, making her shiver. Adrian was already moving. Without a word, he slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was so simple, so effortless, but it made her chest tighten. Better, he asked. She nodded, fingers tightening around the lapels. Yeah. He didn't take his eyes off her, and suddenly the space between them felt too small. The air thickened, charged with something undeniable. Her pulse thrummed. She should have looked away, but she didn't. Because this moment, this feeling was something she hadn't felt in a long time, and it terrified her, because it felt like falling. The drive back to Natalie's apartment was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be filled. It was heavy with something else, something unspoken and charged. She could still feel the warmth of Adrian's jacket around her shoulders, the weight of his gaze lingering even as she stared out the window at the city lights flashing past. Tonight had been unexpected in every possible way. From the private rooftop dinner to the way he looked at her like she was something worth discovering, none of it made sense. And yet, she didn't want to question it. As the car pulled up in front of her building, Adrian shifted slightly, turning to face her. I'll walk you up, she hesitated. Not because she didn't want him to, but because the idea of him stepping into her world even just for a moment felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready for. But instead of arguing, she nodded. They stepped out of the car, the night air cool against her skin. The city hummed around them, distant sirens, the faint chatter of people walking by, but it all felt muted compared to the awareness burning between them. Inside, the elevator ride was short, but it felt stretched thin with anticipation. When they reached her door, she turned to face him, fingers playing with the edge of his jacket still draped over her. Tonight was. She trailed off, searching for the right word. Adrian's lips twitched. Unexpected, she let out a soft laugh. That's one way to put it. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the best possible way. Did you enjoy it? She swallowed, her heart knocking against her ribs. Yeah, she admitted. I did. His gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest second before flicking back up. Her breath hitched. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and the terrifying part, she wanted him to. But instead he reached out, his fingers brushing against the edge of the jacket. Keep it, he said, his voice low. It suits you. She exhaled, something warm curling inside her. You're impossible. His smirk deepened. I've been told. She shook her head, pushing the door open. Good night, Adrian. His eyes lingered on her for a fraction longer before he nodded. Good night, Natalie. And then he was gone. She shut the door, leaning against it, her heart still racing. What was she doing? Whatever this was, it wasn't simple, and that scared her more than anything. The next morning, Natalie was jolted back into reality by the shrill ring of her phone. Bleary-eyed, she reached for it, her stomach flipping when she saw the unknown number. Hello, Natalie Parker, a crisp professional voice asked. Yes, this is she. This is Evelyn Carter from Sterling & Co. We'd like to formally offer you the position, her breath caught. Wait, you're serious? We were impressed with your interview, Evelyn continued smoothly. We'd love to have you on board. For a moment, Natalie was too stunned to speak. All the late nights, the countless interviews, the rejection emails, this was the moment she'd been waiting for. Yes, she finally managed. I'd love to accept. Wonderful. We'll send over the details. Welcome to the team, Miss Parker. When the call ended, she sat there for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. She'd done it, her dream job. Everything she'd been working toward. So why, in the middle of all that excitement, was there a small voice in the back of her mind whispering about Adrian? Shaking off the thought, she focused on the future. This was what she wanted, and nothing, not even a ridiculously charming billionaire, was going to distract her from it. A week passed in a blur of new responsibilities, meetings, and long hours at Sterling & Co. Natalie threw herself into the job, determined to prove she belonged. It should have been enough to keep her mind occupied, but Adrian Reeves was a persistent thought she couldn't shake. They hadn't spoken since that night. No texts, no calls. And for some reason, that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. So when she found herself at the firm's networking gala, a high-profile event filled with executives, investors, and clients, she wasn't expecting to see him. But of course, Adrian Reeves was impossible to avoid. She spotted him the moment she stepped into the grand ballroom. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, effortlessly commanding the room with his presence, he was impossible to ignore. And unfortunately, he spotted her just as quickly. His eyes locked onto hers from across the space, something unreadable flickering in them. Her breath caught, her pulse stuttering. A slow, knowing smirk curved his lips before he started making his way toward her. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to move, to look away, to pretend she wasn't affected by him. But she didn't. She held her ground even as he stopped in front of her. "Natalie," he greeted smoothly. She lifted her chin. "Adrian?" His gaze swept over her, lingering just long enough to make her skin heat. "You look impressive." She rolled her eyes. "It's a work event, not a date." His smirk deepened. "Pity," she exhaled sharply, determined not to let him get under her skin. "What are you doing here?" "I'm an investor in Sterling & Co.," he said casually. Of course he was. She swallowed. "So this is just business for you?" Something flickered in his expression. "Not everything is business, Natalie." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. But before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Adrian," a tall, elegant blonde purred as she stepped up beside him, looping her arm through his like she belonged there. Natalie's stomach twisted. She had no right to feel whatever this was. But that didn't stop the sharp pang in her chest as the woman smiled at her. "And who's this?" Adrian's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Natalie forced a polite smile. "Natalie Parker," she said smoothly. "Sterling & Co.'s newest hire." The blonde's gaze flickered with mild disinterest before she turned back to Adrian. "We should go." "People are waiting." Adrian hesitated, eyes locking onto Natalie's, but she didn't give him a chance to say anything. Instead, she smiled coolly. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Reeves." Then she turned and walked away, ignoring the way her heart ached, because this whatever it had been was over before it had even started. Natalie spent the rest of the night pretending she wasn't affected. She smiled at colleagues, made polite conversation with executives, and sipped champagne like she wasn't hyper-aware of Adrian Reeves somewhere in the room. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she could feel him. Every time she laughed at something someone said, she knew he was watching. Every time she turned her head just slightly, she caught glimpses of him in the crowd. He was talking to people, shaking hands, wearing that effortless confidence like a second skin. And yet, there was something else in his posture, a stiffness, like he was holding himself back. Good, she had no right to feel jealous about the woman at his side. But that didn't mean she was going to stand there and let herself be pulled into something that was never meant for her. She wasn't the kind of woman who belonged in Adrian Reeves' world. And tonight had been a very loud reminder of that, so she forced herself to focus on work. To talk strategy with her new team, to absorb everything she could about the company she had fought so hard to work for. It was supposed to be a distraction. But then, as she stepped away from a conversation, she felt his presence behind her. Close, too close. "Natalie." His voice was low, controlled. She inhaled sharply before turning to face him. "Mr. Reeves." His jaw twitched. "Mr. Reeves," She tilted her head, keeping her expression unreadable. "That's your name, isn't it?" Something flickered in his gaze, something sharp. He exhaled, stepping even closer, lowering his voice. "You walked away." She lifted her chin. "You were busy." His lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not why." She swallowed, refusing to let herself be swayed. "It doesn't matter why, Adrian." "It does," he said, his voice quieter now. "You know it does." She hated how easily he could do this, how a few words from him could unravel her, but she wouldn't let it, not tonight. She forced a smile. "Enjoy your evening." Then she turned and walked away, and this time he didn't stop her. The next morning, Natalie woke up early, determined to shake off whatever lingering emotions last night had left behind. Adrian Reeves was nothing more than a complication. And she didn't have room for complications. Work was her focus, her future, so she threw herself into it. The next few weeks were a blur of long hours, strategy meetings, and late nights at the office. Sterling & Co. was everything she had worked for, and she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. But no matter how busy she was, Adrian Reeves was never far from her mind. She didn't see him after the gala, didn't hear from him, and maybe that was for the best, except she missed him. More than she wanted to admit, it was stupid. They barely knew each other. And yet she found herself thinking about him at the strangest moments. Like when she passed a sleek black car on the street, or when she caught the faintest scent of expensive cologne in an elevator, or when she looked at his jacket, still hanging in her closet. She should have given it back, but she didn't, and she didn't know why. One evening, after another long day, Natalie was packing up her things when her boss, Evelyn Carter, appeared at her desk. "Parker," Evelyn said smoothly. "A word," Natalie nodded, following her into the office. Evelyn gestured for her to sit. "You've been doing good work." Natalie straightened. "Thank you." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "And because of that, I'm giving you a new account." Natalie's pulse kicked up. "Really?" Evelyn slid a folder across the desk. "It's a high-profile client." "You'll be leading the strategy." Natalie's fingers tightened around the folder as she opened it, and then her stomach dropped. Reeves Enterprises, her breath caught. Evelyn didn't seem to notice her hesitation. "This is a big deal. Adrian Reeves is one of our most important clients. I trust you won't disappoint." Natalie forced a smile. "Of course not." Evelyn nodded once, then dismissed her with a glance. Natalie walked out of the office, folder clutched tightly in her hands. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But as she stared down at the documents, at Adrian's name in bold print, reality settled in. She was going to have to see him again, and there was no walking away this time. Natalie stood in front of the towering glass entrance of Reeves Enterprises, gripping the folder in her hands so tightly that the edges crumpled slightly. She forced herself to take a steadying breath. This was just business. A client meeting, nothing more, but her pulse betrayed her, thrumming wildly as she stepped inside. The sleek, modern lobby was a testament to wealth and power: high ceilings, polished marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. People moved with purpose, dressed in crisp suits and designer heels, exuding the kind of confidence that came with working for one of the most powerful companies in the city. She adjusted her blazer and approached the receptionist, clearing her throat. "Natalie Parker from Sterling & Co. I have a meeting with Mr. Reeves." The woman barely glanced up before pressing a button on her headset. "Miss Parker is here for Mr. Reeves." A moment later, a tall man in a tailored navy suit appeared. "Miss Parker?" "Yes," she said, straightening. "I'm Daniel, Mr. Reeves' chief of staff. He's expecting you." "Follow me." She nodded and fell into step beside him as they made their way to the private elevator. The mirrored walls reflected her composed exterior, but inside she was anything but calm. She wasn't sure what she expected when the elevator doors opened, but the top floor of Reeves Enterprises was even grander than she imagined. Expansive floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, and the open concept office was sleek, modern, and intimidatingly pristine. Daniel gestured toward a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. "Mr. Reeves is inside." Natalie hesitated only for a second before nodding and pushing the doors open. Adrian stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city. He didn't turn right away, but she knew he was aware of her presence. The air in the room was thick with something unspoken. After a beat, he finally turned, his gaze locking onto hers. "Natalie." Her throat went dry. He looked effortlessly powerful in his tailored black suit, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Reeves," she said smoothly, keeping her voice professional. His lips quirked, but the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're back to that." She ignored the way her pulse skittered. "This is a business meeting." He studied her for a moment before nodding toward the table. "Then let's get to it." She walked over, setting her folder down, but she could feel his gaze on her the entire time. "Sterling & Co. has prepared a strategy for your upcoming expansion," she said, flipping open the documents. "We've outlined a public relations approach that will position Reeves Enterprises as an industry leader in sustainable development." Adrian leaned back in his chair, watching her with a sharp, assessing gaze. "Go on." She kept her voice steady as she walked through the proposal, but it was difficult to focus when he was sitting across from her, his presence overwhelming the room. When she finished, she closed the folder and met his gaze. "Any questions?" Adrian was silent for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Then, instead of addressing the proposal, he said, "Why didn't you call?" Her stomach flipped. "Excuse me." After the gala, his voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. Something she couldn't quite place. "You disappeared." "I was working," she said evenly, "and now I'm here for work." His jaw tightened slightly. "Is that all this is, then?" she exhaled sharply. "Adrian, we're in your office, discussing a business proposal." "Yes, this is work." His gaze searched hers, like he was looking for something she wasn't sure she could give. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I read the proposal." "It's solid, but you already knew that," she swallowed. "Then do we have a deal?" His lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "You really want to keep this strictly professional, don't you? It's for the best." He didn't respond right away, just studied her with an intensity that made her heart race. Then finally he exhaled and nodded. "Fine, we have a deal." Relief and something else, something that felt dangerously close to disappointment, washed over her. She stood, gathering her things. "I'll have the final documents sent over by tomorrow." Adrian rose as well, but he didn't move away. As she reached for the folder, his fingers brushed against hers, the contact brief but electric. She inhaled sharply but didn't pull away fast enough. His voice was low when he spoke. "You're really going to pretend none of this meant anything?" Her throat tightened. She couldn't do this. "Not here, not now," so she forced herself to square her shoulders to meet his gaze with unwavering resolve. "I have to." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then finally he gave a slow nod. "If that's what you want." It wasn't, but she didn't say that. Instead, she turned and walked out of his office, leaving Adrian Reeves behind, or at least trying to. Natalie tried to lose herself in work, in the endless meetings, in the reports that piled up on her desk. She told herself that was all that mattered: her career, her future. But no amount of strategic planning could erase the memory of Adrian's words, the way he had looked at her, like he was daring her to admit the truth she refused to speak. And the worst part: the more she tried to push him away, the more he seemed to linger in the corners of her mind. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she knew the truth. She had fallen for him. And she had been a fool to think she could pretend otherwise. Days passed, turning into weeks, and she kept telling herself she was fine. That she could handle this, that working with Adrian wouldn't affect her. But then came the charity gala. It was one of Sterling and Co.'s biggest events of the year, a night where the city's most powerful gathered, draped in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, sipping champagne as they made deals over whispered conversations. Natalie wasn't supposed to care that Adrian would be there. But the moment she stepped into the grand ballroom, she felt it, that unmistakable pull, the one that had never really gone away. And then she saw him. Adrian stood near the balcony, his black tuxedo fitting him perfectly, his expression unreadable as he listened to someone speak. But as if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes locked and the air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken, something impossible to ignore. For the first time in weeks, she let herself feel it. And that was her mistake. Because a moment later, a woman stepped up beside him, a striking brunette in an emerald silk gown, her manicured hand resting lightly on his arm as she laughed at something he said. Natalie's chest tightened. She had no right to feel this way. She had been the one to walk away, the one to insist on keeping things professional, the one who had convinced herself this was for the best. So why did it hurt so much? She turned sharply, forcing herself toward the bar, needing a distraction, something, anything, to drown out the ache in her chest. But before she could order a drink, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You're avoiding me," she froze. Slowly, she turned to find Adrian standing there, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were anything but indifferent. "I'm not avoiding you," she said, though even she didn't believe it. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Then why did you leave the moment you saw me?" she exhaled. "Because this," she gestured between them, "this is exactly what I was trying to avoid." His jaw tightened. "And how's that working out for you?" She hated how easily he could unravel her. "Adrian, no," he cut in, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I need to know, Natalie, was it real for you?" Her breath caught. She wanted to lie. She wanted to tell him it hadn't meant anything, that she had walked away because it was the logical thing to do. But she couldn't, because it had been real. More real than anything she had ever known, and the look in his eyes told her he already knew the answer. "Why are you asking me this?" she whispered. His expression softened, but there was something else there too, something raw, something vulnerable. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." Her heart clenched. She had spent so long convincing herself that walking away had been the right choice, that she had been protecting herself. But what if she had been wrong? What if, by trying to protect herself, she had only ended up hurting them both? Adrian took a step closer, his voice lower now. "Tell me to walk away and I will. But if you feel even half of what I feel, then don't lie to yourself anymore." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She could end it right now, push him away for good. Say the words that would close this chapter forever. But when she opened her mouth, they weren't the words she expected. "I don't want you to walk away." The moment the words left her lips, something shifted in Adrian's expression, something fierce, something sure. And then, before she could second-guess herself, before she could talk herself out of it, he reached for her. His hand was warm against her skin as he cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her jaw. "Then don't run," he murmured. And this time she didn't. When his lips met hers, it was like everything else faded, the noise, the people, the world beyond this moment. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Natalie wasn't afraid of falling. Natalie didn't know how long they stood there on the balcony, wrapped in the quiet heat of the moment. The city stretched out beneath them, glittering, endless, but none of it mattered. Not when Adrian was looking at her like this, like she was the only thing in the world worth paying attention to. She had spent weeks convincing herself that walking away had been the right thing to do, that keeping her distance had been for the best. But now, standing here with his hand warm against her skin, his touch anchoring her in ways she hadn't even realized she needed. It all felt like a lie. Because the truth was, she had never really let him go, and she didn't want to. Adrian exhaled slowly, his thumb tracing a gentle line along her jaw before he finally spoke. "Come with me," her heart stuttered. "Where?" His lips curved, but there was something softer in his eyes now, something hesitant, like he wasn't sure she'd say yes. "Somewhere that isn't here." It wasn't just about leaving the gala. She knew that. He was asking for more than just a moment. He was asking her to take a chance. And for the first time she wanted to. She nodded. "Okay." Adrian's fingers slid down to her hand, lacing through hers, and just like that, everything else fell away. They left the gala without looking back, slipping through the grand doors and into the waiting car outside. The driver didn't ask questions, didn't need to. The moment Adrian gave the address, they were in motion, the city lights flashing past in a blur. Natalie glanced over at him, studying the sharp cut of his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around hers like he was afraid she might change her mind. She squeezed his hand lightly. "You don't have to look so serious." His gaze flicked to hers, something unreadable in his expression. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for you to say yes." Her breath caught. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything at all. When the car finally pulled to a stop, she realized where they were. The rooftop. The same place where he had taken her that night, where the city had stretched out beneath them, where everything had felt impossibly perfect for just a few stolen hours. Her chest tightened. Adrian led her out of the car, his grip never loosening as they stepped onto the rooftop. It was just as she remembered: soft golden lights, a quiet breeze, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond them. But this time, there was something different. This time, she wasn't trying to convince herself to walk away. Adrian turned to face her, his free hand tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Tell me you don't regret this." She shook her head. "I don't." Something in his expression shifted, like relief, like disbelief, like something he had been holding back for too long had finally broken free. And then he was kissing her again, slow and deep, like he was making up for every second they had spent apart. Natalie melted into him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket, holding on like she was afraid this might slip through her fingers if she let go. But for once, she wasn't afraid. Because this, whatever this was, it felt inevitable. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I don't do this," he admitted quietly. She frowned slightly. "Do what?" "This." His fingers traced slow circles against her back. "Let people in." Her chest tightened. "Why me?" His lips curved slightly, but his eyes were serious. "Because you got into my car that night like you belonged there, and somehow, ever since, I haven't been able to imagine my life without you in it." Her heart ached in the best possible way. She had spent so much time trying to convince herself that Adrian Reeves was out of reach, that whatever was between them wasn't real. But it was. And maybe, just maybe, she was done pretending otherwise. She exhaled softly, letting her fingers trail over his jaw. "Then don't imagine it." His breath caught. And then he kissed her again, and everything else faded away. Natalie didn't know how long they stood there, wrapped in the quiet certainty of the moment, the city stretching out beneath them like it was theirs alone. But eventually, reality crept in, as it always did. Adrian exhaled, his hand still resting against the small of her back like he wasn't quite ready to let go. "Come home with me." Her heart stuttered. Not from shock, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what he was asking. This wasn't about one night, this was about something bigger. Something real. And for once, she wasn't afraid of what that meant. She nodded. The ride to his penthouse passed in a blur of anticipation, of unspoken words and stolen glances. When they arrived, he led her inside, and she took in the space for the first time. It was everything she expected: sleek, modern, a view of the city that stretched on forever. But there were hints of something else, too. A collection of books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, a record player in the corner. A half-full glass of whiskey on the counter, like he had left in a hurry and never returned. It was a home, not just a showpiece. She turned to face him, her pulse thrumming. "This is you." His lips curved slightly. "All of it," she nodded. "Yeah, it feels like you." Something flickered in his gaze before he stepped closer, his fingers trailing lightly down her arm. "And do you feel like you belong here?" The question settled deep in her chest. She knew what he was really asking. If she was ready for this, for him, for them, and she was. She reached up, pressing her palm against his cheek. "I do." Adrian exhaled as if he had been holding his breath, and then his lips were on hers, slow and sure, like he was savoring the moment, like he was memorizing her. And maybe he was. Because this was real, and neither of them was running anymore. Days blurred into weeks, and with them, the quiet certainty of being with Adrian settled into something that felt effortless, natural, like they had always been meant to find their way here. Mornings spent in his kitchen, bare feet against cool marble floors, coffee in hand as they talked about everything and nothing. Late nights wrapped in quiet laughter, tangled in sheets, in whispered promises that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. She had never expected this. Had never imagined that the life she had been chasing for so long would lead her here to him. And yet, she had never felt more at home. One evening, as she curled up on the couch with a book, Adrian sat beside her, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. "What?" she asked, smiling. He shook his head, exhaling softly. "I've been thinking." She raised a brow. "Dangerous." He smirked but didn't take the bait. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught. Adrian held it between them, his gaze steady. "I know this is fast." Her heart pounded. "But I also know that I don't want to spend another second pretending like I don't already know how this ends." He opened the box, revealing a ring, simple, elegant, timeless. "With you." "Always." Tears burned behind her eyes. "Adrian," he leaned closer, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "I don't want to wait, Natalie. I don't want to waste time when I already know there will never be anyone else." A laugh bubbled past her lips, shaky and breathless. "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" His smile was soft. "Not when it comes to you." Her vision blurred as she nodded, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "Yes." A slow, relieved exhale left his lips before he slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing the moment with a kiss that tasted like forever. And this time there was no fear, no hesitation. Just love, and a future they would build together.